In our list of 10 MMA fighters with notorious Achilles heels, spoiler alert, Jon Jones was placed at number 1, and for good reason. The greatest light heavyweight champion of all time seemingly has no weaknesses beyond getting in his own way. Jon's complicated legacy will, at this point, always consist of two major narratives: what he was able to accomplish in the cage, and how he consistently tore himself down outside of it. Given his most recent troubles, now seems as good a time as ever to give you a complete rundown of the negative events that have most impacted Jon's career over the years. Let's hope this piece won't need any updating in the future. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and this is a history of Jon Jones' outside the cage issues. Foremost, the first story that comes to mind, the first crack in the facade for the UFC's bright young champion, came 4 fights into his title reign when Jones was arrested for DWI in May of 2012. But there are a few incidences prior to that which, while minor, do paint a picture of an earlier version of Jon having issues on the road, a consistent theme throughout his MMA career. According to records obtained by Sports Illustrated, Jones was involved in 3 vehicular incidents spanning from 2008 to 2011. And while Jon was not found to be at fault in 2 of the collisions, it was noted that Jones was passing unsafely in 1 incident. The third situation saw Jon's vehicle towed for drifting as well as driving on a suspended license. All charges were later dropped, though. The fact that Jon was driving on a suspended license does help paint a picture of someone who has consistently been unsafe on the road. The narrative at the time of his first high-profile issue was that the success and the fame had gone to his head, but these previous incidents may contradict that. Now that we've fleshed out an early timeline a bit more, the first major incident, as I previously mentioned, was Jon's DWI arrest in May of 2012 in New York. Jones crashed his Bentley Continental into a utility pole around 5 a.m. on the 19th. The damage to the vehicle substantial enough to total it out. When police arrived, neither Jon nor his 2 passengers had sustained major injury, but Jones was showing signs of intoxication. When he refused a breathalyzer test, he was taken into custody. Jones was initially charged with DWI as well as improper turning and deviating from a direct course, but those 2 charges were dropped when Jon pled guilty to the DWI. The champ was fined $1,000, had his license suspended for 6 months, would be required to complete a victim's impact class, and have ignition interlocks installed on his vehicle, so he would essentially have to prove anytime he wanted to start his car that he wasn't intoxicated. Many felt that Jon's persona at the time was a bit contrived, so the incident certainly fed into those fans who thought he was simply putting on a fake nice guy facade. But the reaction to his DWI paled in comparison to his next major controversy, the cancellation of UFC 151. At the time of the DWI, the fight with Dan Henderson at 151 was already scheduled. That August, Henderson would be forced out with a knee injury, and Jones would deny the UFC's replacement fighter Chael Sonnen, thus causing the event to be cancelled, as Zuffa felt the card wasn't strong enough to support the pay-per-view model, and it wasn't. I've done a pretty deep dive video into this incident, and while at the time the backlash was nearly entirely on Jon Jones, as the UFC and many fans placed the blame almost solely in his lap, it should be noted the timing of the incident as it relates to that DWI, because an argument could be made that of the parties involved in 151's cancellation, there was already a considerable amount of negative sentiment still lingering over Jon's perceived fake persona and the pie in the face of getting arrested earlier that year. It's easier to open the door and toss a guy you don't like under the bus than it is the legendary and beloved Dan Henderson or the UFC, who many fans consistently side with during these types of situations. The 151 cancellation would linger over Jon's career for a considerable amount of time, but beyond that, the next 3 years only saw a few minor incidents. In April of 2014, fans brought to light a series of homophobic comments Jones had left on an Alexander Gustafsson fan's Instagram photos. After receiving backlash, Jon claimed to have lost his phone and had his IG account hacked. It should be noted that around the time of the comments in question, a new photo of Jones was posted on his Instagram. I only bring up this issue not because it greatly impacted his career, but because of the implausible nature of his defense, something that would remain a theme in the eyes of many critics going forward. That August, Jon and Daniel Cormier would get into a brawl while promoting their scheduled upcoming UFC 178 matchup. Nobody was seriously hurt, but Jon was fined $50,000 and given 40 hours of community service by the Nevada State Athletic Commission for his role in the incident. During the hearing, Jon told Nevada that the brawl had lost him a lucrative Nike contract, but the champion went back on that statement during the UFC 182 conference call, stating that Nike simply wasn't interested in MMA anymore. Despite being under oath when he seemingly lied about the Nike deal, nothing more came of the situation. Only 3 days after defeating DC for the first time at UFC 182 in January of 2015, it was announced that a cocaine metabolite was found in John's system during a random test in December prior to the bout. However, before USADA, cocaine was not banned out of competition, and a week prior to the fight, Jones was tested again, but came up clean and was allowed to compete. When word got out of the failure, John checked himself into rehab voluntarily and then voluntarily left a day later. For violating their code of conduct, the UFC fined Jones $25,000. INSAC, who shouldn't have even been testing for a substance that's not banned out of competition, took no action against Jones as they were in the wrong for even releasing the failure. John told Ariel Helwani later that year he'd considered suing the organization.
I have up to 3 years to sue them for what they did to me. Let's just say I haven't forgot about it.
It wouldn't be long after the cocaine debacle that Jones would face arguably the worst controversy of his entire career. That April, news broke that the light heavyweight champion had been involved in a 3-car hit-and-run collision in Albuquerque and was currently wanted by police. After running a red light and hitting a vehicle crossing the intersection, which then subsequently crashed into the front end of another car at the stop, witnesses say Jones fled from the scene only to return moments later to grab handfuls of cash and then stuff them in his pants and run away again. That must have been a sight. Since Jones fled the scene and didn't bother to check on any of the other parties, he was unaware that one of the victims was a pregnant woman who had broken her arm, and so what was originally a misdemeanor was now a felony charge. Police on the scene found drug paraphernalia in John's rental car, as well as identifying information. That night, Jones surrendered to police and would post bail. Following his first hearing, Dana and Lorenzo flew to New Mexico and stripped the champion of his title, took him off the official UFC rankings, and suspended him indefinitely. John pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and received 18 months probation, as well as being required to make 72 separate appearances at local schools to let kids know they shouldn't act like he does. Jones avoided jail time completely, and so long as he followed the sentencing, the conviction wouldn't even be made official. Less than a year later, John would find himself behind bars following another traffic incident in ABQ. Jones alleged he was acknowledging some fans at a stoplight who were trying to get his attention by revving his engine. The local police had a differing opinion on what he was up to and pulled over the UFC star. The stop was recorded and released to the public from the officer's body cam, and John Jones was not very happy about what was going on, to say the least.
Okay, so you caught, I was driving wild tonight. You're fucking lying, buddy. You're lying. Dude,
okay.
You are ridiculous.
Okay, you have a good night, sir.
You are ridiculous.
Initially charged with unlawful drag racing, unlawful exhibition driving, failure to maintain a traffic lane, unlawful use of modification of exhaust systems, and improper display of registration plate, most of that would get thrown out. But since Jones was still on probation, he would be brought in and spend a few days in the county lockup before seeing the judge. Jones got a 90-day deferred sentence, would need permission from his probie officer anytime he wanted to drive, 60 hours of community service, aggressive driving school, anger management, and a whopping $143 fine. The judge did lay a pretty ominous warning on the champ's lap, though, saying,
If you come back, it won't go well. So take it seriously.
Yes, sir.
For the next few years, John would most certainly keep himself out of that courtroom, but that doesn't mean he kept himself away from self-destructive controversies. Jones was meant to fight for the title he was stripped of upon returning to the UFC in April of 2016, but current champion Cormier injured his foot, and so Jones was placed in an interim title fight with Ovince St. Preux, which he won, setting up an absolutely mega showdown with DC at what was to be the biggest show in the promotion's history, UFC 200. That was until John tested positive for a pair of estrogen blockers, clomiphene and letrozole, the day before the card. DC would instead fight Anderson Silva in a non-title bout, and while the event was still a huge success, Jones had butchered its main event, one of the most highly anticipated rematches of all time. John was stripped of his interim title, and despite USADA ruling that Jones' excuse of a tainted gas station dick pill was valid, as he was able to present evidence, he was still suspended for a year, retroactive to the date of the failure. He would make his triumphant return from suspension at UFC 214. After more than 2 years without his crown, the king returned to dethrone his usurper in spectacular fashion, finishing Cormier off with a devastating head kick and brutal beatdown. It looked like everything had turned around for Jones. At least that was the narrative for about a month, until USADA announced that the Lion King had failed a test the day before he defeated DC. The drug? Turinabol. Steroids. California changed the fight result to a no contest, and the UFC stripped Jones yet again and placed his belt back on his bitter rival. Seeing as this was John's second run-in with USADA in less than a year's time, I can't help but think about what the judge told John in Albuquerque. It would not go well. But it kinda did. John was facing a 48-month suspension. That's 4 years in case you didn't want to do the math. Essentially a career death sentence for most. However, 30 of those months would be knocked off as Jones utilized the substantial assistance clause in USADA's bylaws. Essentially, if you can give them actionable information that leads to other dopers being caught or their sources, you can have a reduction in your sentencing. USADA cited this program in their official decision on Jones, but John's management immediately refuted this idea of their client being a snitch. What Jones did, if anything, to help USADA is still unknown and led to rampant speculation as to whether John was getting preferential treatment because of his star status. Unfortunately, we will never know what happened as these records are sealed, so to quote Max Holloway,
"You know, it is what it is."
The other 18 months got chopped down to 15 when an arbiter determined that JBJ didn't intentionally cheat. This time around, there was no smoking tainted dick pill for John to turn to. He submitted all kinds of suppies, but none of them came up positive for the steroid. No, this decision was made because Jones only failed one test. He hadn't failed the 8 others in the months prior to the event, the 8 that happened to be random. The only test he pissed hot was the test he knew was scheduled. Since that didn't make any logical sense to the arbiter, 3 months were knocked off of the sentence. John served his time yet again, and wouldn't you know it, the very next event, another issue would pop up. Quite literally, Jones's scheduled return was a highly anticipated rematch with Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232 for the now vacant light heavyweight strap. 6 days before the card was meant to go down in sunny Las Vegas, Nevada, the event was moved to sunny Inglewood, California, when NSAC refused to license Jones because of some atypical findings in his most recent USADA tests. That Chirinabol John was suspended for following UFC 214, it had apparently popped back up in his system. USADA theorized that what was happening was the metabolite lay dormant in Jones's body and could occasionally pop back up or pulse from time to time, potentially for the rest of his career. UFC and Jeff Nowitzki did a PR tour explaining that the trace amount in JBJ's system was so small as to be measured in picograms, something Nowitzki repeatedly described as splitting a grain of salt into 50 million pieces and having only one of the remaining particles to equate to the measurement. Essentially, their stance was, there's no way this amount could have enhanced his performance, and because they felt this was not a re-ingestion, he shouldn't be punished. Nevada simply needed more time to do their own investigation, which is why they pulled the plug on his license. But California was more than okay with USADA's explanation, so long as John agreed to additional VADA testing for the next 6 months, and so the fight went on as planned. Jones recaptured his title in the 3rd round. As you can imagine, yet again, fans began to speculate as to whether or not Jones was receiving special treatment, especially considering other fighters with trace amounts of PEDs had the book thrown at them in the past by USADA. Nonetheless, it would be the last real drug-related controversy in JBJ's career as of this writing. All that remains are a few more legal woes. Less than a year after Pico-gate, Jones pled no contest in a battery case involving a waitress at a local strip club that John reportedly got physically aggressive with during a night out with the boys.
John put his arm around me or something, pretty tight, and I was like, oh, you're gonna put me in a chokehold. The issue is that when you put me back down over by the bar, he smacked my
The judge banned JBJ from the club and gave him a 90-day deferred sentence with all the usual rules and stipulations. Don't commit other crimes for the next 3 months. John would wait a whole 249 days to get arrested again, blowing that 90-day deferred sentence out of the water. Amidst the current pandemic lockdown in late March, Jones was brought in for aggravated DWI, meaning he was at least twice over the legal limit, negligent use of a firearm, possession of an open container, and driving with no proof of insurance. After police heard a gunshot, they arrived to an area in downtown Albuquerque with Jones parked in the street speaking to a few homeless people. The officers saw signs of intoxication, and after failing field sobriety tests, Jones was arrested again. The entire incident was recorded on the officer's body cam and released to the public. This time around, John was very respectful and regretful.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
If it's not too much, could you go down there?
Of course.
A gun and a spent round were found in the vehicle, as was an open container. John pled guilty to the DWI, and so the other charges were dropped. He was sentenced to 96 hours of house arrest, a year of probation, 90 days of therapy, and 48 hours of community service. A sentence many felt was pretty light given his history, but these are difficult times given the current crisis, and that factored into the state's decision. And so there you have it. $76,143 in fines, 3 stripped titles, 268 hours of community service, 42 months of suspension from fighting, 30 months of probation, 2 90-day deferred sentences, 4 days of house arrest, who knows how many suspended licenses, and a whole bunch of courses on how not to be an asshole. It's a pretty staggering timeline when you look at it all together, and John's self-destructive patterns are evident throughout. Here's to hoping his remorseful tears at his most recent run-in with the law will spark a change in his reckless behavior, because being stripped of his titles and losing years of his career are nothing compared to some of the potential outcomes of his actions if he continues on this current path. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Huge shout out to Max Randall for editing this video together. Follow him on Twitter at Max_Randall. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter, and have yourself a wonderful day.